Good morning, everyone. Let's open our Bibles to the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 3 to 11. The heading of the passage is praise to the God of all comfort. I read, praise to the God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the suffering of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, this for your comfort and salvation. If you are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, so also you share in our comfort. We do not want you uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received a sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us, as you help us by your prayers. Then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor God granted us in answer to the prayers of men. Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here again and to see all of you present this morning. And you're visiting with us. We're glad that you're with us today. On the 1st of November in 1755, an earthquake struck the city of Lisbon in Portugal. In the first 6 minutes, 15,000 people were killed. This event that caused so much suffering, death, and destruction had a deep impact upon the French philosopher Voltaire, and he referred to it in many of his writings. He saw this earthquake as evidence against the existence of a good and all-powerful God. In his poem on the disaster of Lisbon, he asked, but how can one conceive a God, goodness itself, who lavishes blessings on the children he loves, and yet pours wrongs upon them by the handful? He's asking the question that many have asked many times. How could a good God bring wrong upon the people he loves? How could God allow bad things to happen to good people? It's a question that I suppose many people are asking today in the light of recent events that's happening around the world. The existence and the experience of suffering in its many different forms has caused many people to question the goodness and the power of God. The problem was expressed in the early years of the church's existence by the writer Augustine, when he said either God cannot abolish evil or he will not. If he cannot, then he is not all powerful. If he will not, then he's not all good. And from more recent times, C.S. Lewis in his book The Problem of Pain put it this way: if God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. It seems to be a contradiction that these two things cannot exist in God at the same time. The experience of suffering seems to many people to deny the existence of the all-powerful God, the loving God that we read about in the Bible. The problem of suffering is faced really only by those who do believe in the God of the Bible. Suffering is not a problem for the atheist to explain, the one who does not believe in God. In their case, suffering is just part of the natural order of things, the consequence of survival of the fittest. And suffering is not a problem for those who believe in the existence of many gods. none of which are all-powerful. And so it's a unique problem for those who believe in one all-powerful and loving God. And there is no simple answer to the question of suffering, and the Bible makes no attempt to provide one. Rather, the Bible accepts the existence of suffering and teaches us how to cope with it when it comes. But what do we mean when we talk about suffering? What is suffering? We know that suffering can present itself in many forms. I know some of you work in hospitals or healthcare professions, and you see suffering perhaps on a daily basis. What is suffering? Well, there is physical suffering. That's the physical pain or the discomfort that we experience when we are ill or when we've injured ourselves. A disease or an accident may cause it. And our bodies are made in such a way that they are susceptible to that kind of pain. And sometimes physical pain can be a good thing. It can be an early warning system to tell us that something more serious is wrong, and we need to go to the doctor, and we need to take some action to try to see what the matter is. And then there is mental or emotional suffering. We can experience a whole range of different emotions. Some are pleasant and some are not. Some cause us suffering. Grief, sorrow, fear, anxiety, depression, disappointment are some of the emotions or states of mind that we can experience and which can cause us to suffer. We see then that suffering is part of our nature. It's part of being human. It's who we are. We're made with this capacity to suffer, both physically and emotionally, and we all will suffer, some more than others. There's a spectrum of suffering, and people are at different points on it, and some people suffer more than others. But why do we suffer, and what causes suffering? There are several causes that we can perhaps suggest. Well, first, we suffer because we live in a world that has dependable natural laws. At the creation, God established natural laws to govern the universe in which we live. And these natural laws operate the same for all people. They show no favoritism. God doesn't temporarily suspend a law just to protect his own people. Take, for example, the law of gravity. The law of gravity is necessary for our world to function properly. But the law of gravity will also cause us to suffer if we try to violate it or defy it in some way. The person jumps from the top of a building, gravity will pull them down, and they'll no doubt suffer when they hit the ground. It's a consistent and it's a dependable law, but it can cause suffering. And car accidents occur because there's a law that says that no two solid objects can occupy the same space at the same time. So two cars trying to back into one parking space are going to collide because they both cannot be in that space at the same time. Again, God is not going to suspend that law just because you're a Christian. Natural laws also govern weather systems and geological conditions, and these can result in hurricanes and earthquakes and flooding and other natural disasters. The natural laws then that give order and dependability to our world, that allow us to drive our cars and to fly in aeroplanes and to obtain energy for our homes and our industries, can also cause suffering when they are violated or when they're defied or misused in some way, when disorder occurs. So these laws that make it possible for us to have things that we enjoy, constructive things and things that are useful for human life, also introduce the possibility of things that are harmful and destructive and that will cause pain and suffering. The same heat that warms our homes in the winter can cause a fire and hurt people. We also suffer because we are limited in our knowledge of the world in which we live. In the area of medicine, we do not know the cause of many diseases or how to treat them, and people suffer because of that lack of knowledge. Knowledge is something that grows over time through research and through trial and error. And sometimes suffering can be relieved or prevented as new discoveries are made. But our imperfect knowledge of our world will mean that pain and suffering do occur. In 1993, a group of scientists were working on a volcano in Colombia, and all of their instruments indicated that the volcano was stable and safe. But then unexpectedly it erupted, and several scientists were killed and others were seriously injured. If they had better knowledge, better information of the conditions, then their suffering could have been avoided. But suffering occurs when we do not have enough knowledge, or when the knowledge that we do have, when the knowledge that could have prevented suffering is ignored, or when warnings are not heeded, as we've seen in the Grenfell fire incident, where warnings about building materials are not heeded, or in the infected blood scandal as well, where warnings about these things are not heeded. If suffering is to be avoided, then we would have to have perfect knowledge of everything, and we would also have to have the wisdom to apply that knowledge. And that's just not possible. And then another reason why we suffer is because we live in a world of risky relationships. When God created us, he created us for relationships with one another. After creating Adam, he said it is not good that the man should be alone. We are made for relationships, relationships with God and with one another. But entering into relationships involves the risk of pain and suffering. So what happens when relationships go wrong, when they break down, or when they come to an end? The relationship between King David and his son Absalom illustrates what happens when relationships go wrong. Absalom led a rebellion against his father, and in the ensuing conflict, Absalom was killed. And when David was told the news of the death of his son, we read in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33, that the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." David was distraught, and it's the breakdown of that relationship between David and his son led to Absalom's death and caused David's suffering. Think also of the relationship between Jesus and his friend Lazarus. At the tomb of Lazarus, we're told that Jesus wept, and the people standing by said, "See how he loved him." Our ability to love others and our ability to enter friendships and relationships with them also raises the possibility of suffering when those relationships end through death, perhaps, or through personal disputes or disagreements. We risk being hurt. We risk suffering by entering into relationships. And yet most of us are prepared to take that risk because of the value and the good that comes through love and friendship and fellowship with others. To avoid the suffering of broken relationships, we would have to cut ourselves off and live in isolation, and which perhaps none of us would really want that or enjoy that either. And then we suffer as well because we live in a world that gives us freedom of choice. God created us with a free will. God placed the man and the woman in the garden, and he gave them a choice. He said, "You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it you shall die." Adam and Eve had a choice set before them, and they exercised their free will, and they ate from that tree that they were not to eat from, and they suffered as a consequence. One of the greatest gifts God has given us is our free will, our ability to make our own choices. And God, of course, would like us to make good choices, to choose to follow him and to obey him. The choices we make have consequences, and bad choices or wrong choices may result in suffering and pain for ourselves or for others. Free will means that we can deliberately make choices that will result in suffering. We can deliberately choose to do things that will inflict suffering upon others. Young men who choose to carry a knife, and making that choice can have serious consequences. Or we may choose to exercise our free will in a selfish way to try to gain benefit for ourselves. Again, that can result in suffering. Sometimes even good choices can result in suffering. We live our lives by exercising our free will, by the choices that we make, and others are affected by our choices. And sometimes that will involve suffering for others or for ourselves. But the alternative to that is to have a world where no one has freedom of choice or free will, that we would somehow be programmed to act or to behave in a certain way. But then without free will, there would be no accountability, and no one could be held responsible for the way in which they behave. And that perhaps is not the type of the world that we would want either. So we see then that suffering and pain is an unavoidable, and it's a necessary consequence of the type of world in which we live and the type of people that we are. It's a world of dependable natural laws, a world where we have limited knowledge, a world where we are capable of forming and breaking relationships, a world where we have freedom of will and choice, and all of this will inevitably involve suffering and pain at some point. But then what would the alternative be to this type of world, and would we really want it to be any different? Well, if suffering is this unavoidable part of our lives, what should our attitude be towards it? Is it something that is meaningless? Is it something, well, we just simply have to put up with it? Or is there some value to be seen in it? We can suggest several reasons why there is value in suffering. First, suffering is of value because it produces dependency upon God. The psalmist in Psalm 18 and verse 6 says, "In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears." Suffering helps us to realize our own frailties and inadequacies, and we humbly turn to God for help and comfort. And in times of trouble and suffering, God is there as that source of comfort for us. Again, from the Psalms 23 verse 4. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And from our reading, Bismark read for us earlier, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, Paul wrote, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction." And then later in that passage in verse 9, Paul says concerning his own sufferings, why we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not upon ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. And when we look to the cross, and when we see the suffering of Jesus, we notice how he too was drawn closer to God through his suffering. Just before his death, he prayed, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." The suffering is of value then because it causes us to humble ourselves before God, acknowledging him as our source of strength and comfort and deliverance. And then we can suggest that suffering is of value because it produces steadfastness in our own lives. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 3, Paul writes, "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance." James said something similar in his letter, James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you meet various trials, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." To rejoice in our sufferings, to count it all joy when we meet various trials, sounds an unrealistic approach to suffering. What is there to rejoice about in suffering? What joy can be found in trials? Well, the joy is not in the suffering itself, but in what it produces. That it produces endurance or steadfastness, that ability to keep going, to never give up, however difficult things may get. And following on from this, suffering is of value because it leads to maturity in our lives. James continues in that passage in the next verse, verse 4, he says, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The steadfastness produced when faith is tested through trials will lead to maturity or completeness of character for us. Peter also writes of this as well in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. He's to people who are undergoing persecution, to people who are suffering. He says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, which though perishable is tested by fire, may redound to praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Gold is put through the furnace, it's heated up in the crucible in order to remove the impurities. The impurities float to the top and they're scraped off. And then what is left is this purer product of gold. And likewise, our faith may be tested in the furnace of sufferings and trials, but what comes out at the end is something that is more beautiful, something that is purer and more precious. So sufferings can lead to that perfection of our faith. And perhaps surprisingly, the same is said of Jesus himself. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, the writer says, for it was fitting that he, Jesus, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through suffering. The writer's telling us here that God made Jesus, the one who brings salvation. God made him perfect through suffering. Well, we might wonder, well, wasn't Jesus already perfect before he suffered? Well, yes, he was perfect in that he was sinless, but his experience of suffering was also necessary in order to bring him to completeness or maturity. Jesus had to go through everything that we go through, and that included suffering as well. And it is because of his experience of suffering that he is able to help us as well. Again, as Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18 tells us, for because he himself has suffered and been tempted, he is able to help those who are tempted. And then another reason why suffering is of value is because it enables us to give comfort to others. If we've suffered ourselves, then we can be of service in helping others in their time of suffering. And Paul recognized this again from the passage read earlier, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 4. He says that God comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. If we have experienced the comfort of God in our affliction, then we're able to share that comfort with others who are afflicted. And then suffering is of value because it reminds us that our existence here is only temporary. This is not our permanent home, and we're looking for something more glorious. Paul was a man who suffered more than most. And Paul put his own sufferings into perspective when he wrote this in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 and 18. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Paul refers here to his own sufferings as this slight momentary affliction. That's how insignificant he regarded them, like an itch on the end of your nose, this slight momentary irritation. And he says that these things, the things that we see, are transient. They're not going to last. It's the things that are unseen that are eternal. He expresses a similar thought in Romans chapter 8, verse 18 as well, where he says, I consider the sufferings of this present age are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And Paul is not trying to play down suffering at all. He knows suffering. He has much personal experience of suffering that would be unbearable to most of us. But Paul was able to see things from a different perspective. And he knew that these sufferings were just of temporary duration, that something better was waiting for him. Suffering is part of life. It's part of our existence here on this earth. Cannot deny it or pretend it does not exist. We must accept it and we must cope with it. However unpleasant it may be, however much we may want to avoid it, it does have value and it can bring benefit to our lives. It draws us closer to God. It aids the development of a Christian character, leading to steadfastness and maturity. It enables us to be of comfort to others in their suffering. It causes us to look to that eternal glory, something described by John in his vision in Revelation chapter 21, verses 2 and 4, where he says, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Suffering, the suffering of this world, belongs to those former things that will pass away. It will end, it will pass away, and we look forward to that glorious time in God's presence with him himself. Thank you for listening this morning, and may God bless you.